Once we were part of the natural world, bonded to land and sea by work and by living, and by the tools and artefacts we created in our endless struggle to live and prevail. We were the world, and the world was us. In the mid-part of this century, the ancient bond broke down. We have it on film, the moment when this unwritten saga began to fade from our memories. As the century draws to a close, great collections of artifacts are beginning to open up, and in this opening we can trace the elements of lives that changed little for centuries and then changed irrevocably almost overnight. This is the story of everyday people and their lives, people who are further removed from us now than they themselves were removed from the Bronze Age. They endure in the objects they fashioned, farmers and fishermen, boat makers, artisans and craftsmen. What was the stuff of everyday life is now catalogued and stored before being taken down, dusted off and exhibited to us as if it were news from another planet. And yet, in the stories these objects tell, is our story also. These plaited straw nests look exotic to us now. They are intricate objects, and we marvel at the craft that went into making them, at the skills involved in fashioning them. But sometimes admiring them as objects blinds us to a simple truth, that these were once just everyday things, a part of the world of crop and harvest. Whole worlds of work have disappeared, and the tools and instruments of that work are now cut adrift from the context that sustains them. Tradition is the mark and the work of group undertakings, of learning from and giving to others. The lives of people were as interwoven one with another as were the strips of ash used in making this sieve. Winning the harvest was always the work of groups, the family on a small holding, a mehel of family and neighbours on the bigger farms. If a family or an individual found a better, more efficient way of doing some portion of the work, it quickly passed into common practice. Simple sieves remained in widespread use right up until the 1940s. John Hamilton of Knoll, County Dublin, supplied sieves to his neighbours. Filmed by Dr. Tony Lucas and Kevin Danaher in 1948, John was one of the last known sieve makers in Ireland. He learned the trade from an itinerant craftsman at the turn of the century who'd visited the district for a while, making sieves for the local farmers. In the run-up to harvest time, John Hamilton would have been kept busy, making every kind of sieve for barley, oats and wheat. They were needed for winnowing and cleaning the grain in the age-old manner, but by the time this film was made, times had changed and demand had fallen away to nothing. The sieves were made from thin strips of ash, woven into a mesh held tight in a frame of the same wood. It is an ancient and simple human trick, the making of meshes, and it gave us tools, nets, clothing and shelter for thousands of years. Rhymes and stories, touch, shape and smell will trigger these ancient memories, bring half-forgotten lore and learning back up to the light of day. These artifacts are a form of coding, trapping hard-won knowledge, an intricate part of the human story. It is inside, it is outside, it is in the corner with 200 eyes. Of all the everyday miracles of life, the harvest is the most charged with mystery. The year turns through its cycles until the ripe corn makes the heart quicken and the harvesters move to the front rank in the human story. Every available soul went to work on the harvest. The work is urgent as our need for food and fuel It took all the energy the harvesters had. It was a race against time, a battle with the weather. You were conscious of time shortening around you, and then it was all speed and urgency at the end. No matter the crop, big or small, rich or poor. You watched and waited, and then when the moment came, you plunged anxiously into the work. In 1954, on the farm of William Ahern, Bodrameen, County Cork, this large group pitches industriously into the climatic work of the year, the gathering in of all they have worked for. The spirit of the Mayo, the group working together, is at the heart of this industrious scene, as it was at the heart of Irish agriculture for centuries. This time fortune smiles on them. It is a good harvest, and the family have drawn in enough to see them through the long, hard winter months. Land and crop and weather make no bargain with people. It was a hard life, lived on the edge. The crop might fail. Endless, hard work might go for nothing. No one could ever say there would always be bread on the table. Many people were living at subsistence level. For the rural poor, grain was a basic element in their staple diet. Quernstones, the most ancient and basic tools for grinding, were used to mill the grain in the last step in the long line from corn in the fields to bread in the oven. The communities, in their intimate and uneasy communion with the land, formed strong bonds of mutual dependence, families and extended families. All depended on luck and sun and rain and fertility. The men and women who worked the land had a lively and hard-won sense of mystery, of the mystery of life itself. They were in the grip of naked forces they had learned to read as signs. Through wide swathes of the world, the standing corn has a potent force as symbol of life. These harvest tokens evoke ancient cults of fertility, powerful magical beliefs found everywhere in the world where grain is grown.
The harvest bows were given to the ladies primarily by the menfolk because they wanted to court the favour of a nice lady, or maybe she had lots of land, the father had lots of land. It is important now that when you made a harvest bow, that if it was the man that made it, he left the grain of the ears, the whole ear intact, because that contained the seed which was linked with womanhood and fertility and again starting new life, new prosperous life, and the cycle of life.
The living gold of the harvest is the power of the sun brought down into the land. The turning of the sun brought ripeness. The harvest moon sailed over all lives. The spirit of ancient reverence lives on in many guises. Sometimes, for reasons they might find hard to express, people are prompted to relive ancient tradition. Led by Paddy Lavin, this procession moves through the streets of Crossmolina, County Mayo. In a modern town, figures out of an ancient world. The strawboys are reborn, drawn by this wedding in the Dolphin Hotel. The strawboys are also a reminder of an unbroken tradition, even if the magical and religious associations are fractured and faded. straw hats keep the link with fun and mischief, but few have the means now to truly feel their deepest meaning as crowns of harvest. In the past, local men fashioned these hats from straw. In this simple disguise, these uninvited guests found the door open to many a country wedding, and many a young couple had the beginning of their married life signalled and heralded by these figures of fun and gaiety. Straw hats are associated with all kinds of festivity, from the Wren boys to the Christmas rhymers, the Biddy boys to the Halloween geysers. The hats are a signal of mischief and licence, a curiously formal signal of permitted misrule. Sean Loughney of Lacken, County Mayo, needs a good supply of long and uncrushed straw to make these hats. Local farmers enter into the spirit by ensuring a plentiful supply is to hand. The straw must be cut with a scythe to be right, for practical reasons to be sure, but also ensuring another tradition is kept alive. At the other end of the country, these fields in Waddington, County Wexford, are part of the O'Connor family farm and have been worked by the family for over 300 years. Corn has sustained life here through long generations. The future of this farm now lies in the hands of Hugh O'Connor. Hugh has a great regard for the history of the place and a real appreciation of the older ways. A practical man, he blends new and old seamlessly in his daily work. He has discovered the simple truth that many of the old ways still serve a real and valid purpose. Hugh's father kept horses, and when he was young grew black oats on the farm for the horses' feed. The black oats had almost disappeared from the area in the 1950s and are very rarely found in the surrounding district today. Hugh took it on himself to reintroduce the crop on his farm. The straw from the harvest has its own particular qualities. It is ideal for thatching. Jim Burke, Hugh's neighbour, is a very fine thatcher. He recently rethatched Hugh's old family home. In a way, Hugh's harvest is helping keep two old traditions alive. Straw for thatching must be cut and threshed in the traditional way. The combine harvester damages the straw, making it useless for thatching. Wexford was always a grain-growing county, and in the past there was never any shortage of straw for thatching. In this county, at least, the art of thatching still holds its ground. Hugh, his son Joseph, and neighbour Tony Cosgrove moved through the fields on a fine day with a reaper and binder. The machine sweeps through the standing stalks of oats, cutting and binding, and then delivering the tidy sheaves at steady intervals. The reaper binder was popular from the 30s through the 60s. The horse, even more common as an engine of heavy work, was already being replaced by the tractor in the 1950s. Filmed by Desmond Egan in County Wicklow in the 1940s, this horse-drawn mowing machine is a predecessor of the reaper and binder. It's a type that was popular in the early 1900s. A hay rake is used to feed the standing corn into the path of the mower. A machine like this could cut 8 to 10 acres in a day and there were still plenty of jobs for everyone, though not as many as when the corn was cut by hand. On many of the small farms, the predecessor of the mowing machine, the scythe, was still the main instrument of harvest. The scythe arrived in Ireland as early as the 12th century, but did not come into widespread use until the 19th. Bill Egan from Clonfanlock, County Offaly, was filmed by the National Museum in 1972, demonstrating the proper use of the scythe. Bill's scythe had a cradle attached, made of canvas stretched over wire. This catches the stalks as they fall and helps lay them out in neat swathes. The scythe was widespread in Ireland from the late 1800s. Farmers and farm labourers who had worked as migrant labour in England and Scotland brought new harvesting techniques home with them and helped popularise the scythe as an efficient tool. Scythes needed frequent sharpening when in use. Every 10 minutes or so, the scythesman would need to top and sharpen his blade. Curious beliefs sprung up. In some places, people maintained that a small insect kept in a box and fastened to the top of the handle helped keep the blade sharp. The scythe was a personal possession, and the scythesman was often measured and fitted for it. All this made it a precious thing, and there was always a certain reluctance to lend the scythe out to neighbours. The sickle or reaping hook came before the scythe, a tool that goes back to the Bronze Age. It made for back-breaking work. The reaper was constantly bending, pulling the stalks into handfuls which would be individually cut. Harvesting with the sickle was often the work of women. Some maintained that women were physically better suited to all that stooping, but it is noticeable that when the easier scythe came into use, men took over the reaping and left women, in many cases, to continue the stooping and binding. Some harvests were harder than others, and flax was the most back-breaking of them all. You don't cut flax, you pull it, stalk by stalk. Flax has a long history in Ireland. In the latter half of the 18th century, it was often part of the small farm subsistence economy. The fibres of the flax stalk are strong. They cannot be cut with scythe or reaping machine. They have to be pulled by hand so that the entire length of the stalk can be saved. Only then do you get the long linen fibres which were spun and woven into cloth for the family's own use long before the linen industry developed as such. Flax was usually harvested 3 to 4 weeks after the first blue blossoms had appeared. In order to separate the fine linen fibres from the woody stalk of the plant, the crop needed to be steeped or retted. Most farms had a pond or dam for this purpose. The beets or sheaves were layered into the water and left to rot for a week or two. The stalks fermented in this stagnant water, and the pungent stink was unforgettable. Cattle loved this stinking water. It was like beer to them. They couldn't get enough of it. The flax would then be removed from the pond and spread out in rows to dry. The flax harvest was labour-intensive, and the crop was not always profitable when cultivated on a large scale. However, on smaller farms in heavily populated districts, where there was a high proportion of helping hands to the amount of land carrying the crop, it did make economic sense. Harvesting is a race against time. It is also the culmination of a year's risky work, So it is not surprising that complex and curious beliefs attached to it. Nobody, for instance, wanted to be the last in the district to finish a harvest. This was regarded as unlucky, and in some counties, the last farmer seen cutting at harvest time was called the Kíla, or witch. Up in Galway, there was a quite ominous belief. What drove the hurry to finish the harvest was the superstition that he who was last to finish his harvest would be the first to leave this life. A widespread story tells of the spirit of the corn harvest, a spirit of life and goodness who holds sway over the life-giving crop. As the crop is cut, this spirit is confined to a smaller and smaller area until at last it takes refuge in the last stand of corn. It used to be that this last handful of stalks would be the focus of a kind of competition. The harvesters would hurl their reaping hooks at it, and the last reaper to sever the stalks would be champion of the harvest. This sheaf, also known in some places as the Kíla, would be carried home in triumph to preside over the harvest feast. This was a night of celebration and relaxation, the year's work done, the harvest secure. The Kíla swung from the rafters, guarantee of plenty, luck brought indoors, hostage until the next year's successful harvest. All over the land, the corn is cut and stooked. Now the waiting begins. The vast earth holds its breath. It is past high summer. Now sun and wind and waiting must do their work. The God of the harvest enjoys his days of grace. Time itself, if the harvester is lucky, will stretch and flower and be gold. Like the corn harvest, the securing of a supply of turf was a time-consuming and weather-driven task. And again, like the corn harvest, what drove the turf cutting was a spirit of cooperation. Profit was welcome, but not central to the work. What mattered was getting the work done, and families and neighbours would band together in mehels which laboured mightily to draw in fuel for everyone involved. The tool for the job was called a shlán. It was a kind of purpose-adapted spade, and many variations are found across the country. It's a powerful, simple tool in the right hands, and like the scythe, demands both strength and skill. Pádraig Mayo from Inver in County Galway is seen here with family and friends harvesting fuel for the coming winter. May and June are the months when the desolate boglands come alive in a flurry of activity. The job needs to be done quickly, and the entire family pitches in. Women exchange their household tasks for work in the open air. Children disappear from school for a week at a time to lend their help. The turf is cut, spread, footed, and left leaning in small piles to catch the wind. Through June and July it is heaped and built into larger piles. Turnfoots, castles and clamps filled out across the bogs before they are drawn home into the great piles banked against winter cold near the family home. And again the weather is critical. A wet summer means the peat does not dry out, and all are left with a cold, difficult winter ahead. Turf was good for more than fuel. People going through difficult times often survived in crude cabins built entirely or in part from peat or turf. In a sense, it was the fallback resource of the truly destitute. For many in rural Ireland, the turf bank was the only bank they knew or could rely on. People's resourcefulness could be astonishing. In Windy House on the banks of the River Suir, Matt Collins gathers a supply of mud to show how the older people in his area would make mud fuel.
This is the type of fuel we made in years gone by. Blue mud taken from the river bed and slag from coal and made into mud balls made by hand, and they'll burn away for all the night. And just catch a bit of it and roll it in your hands and leave them down and they'll dry, and that's the honest too.
Dr. Tony Lucas of the National Museum was an eminent scholar who gave considerable time to recording the traditional lore of turf cutting and turf making. The making of hand turf is an almost forgotten rural tradition. Patrick Finn and Mr. Daly are demonstrating the making of mud turf in Boherduff, County Galway. Peat is dug out, mixed with water, and pounded with the feet to a malleable consistency. Dr. Lucas was intrigued by the process and undertook a great deal of research in this area. Pleasantly enough, he records that people generally were open with him in their willingness to discuss such things, often as eager as the scholars were to see these local traditions preserved for future time. Mud turf making grew out of necessity. It is found where the peat is too crumbly to be cut by slan. The old people maintained that this was the best turf of all. It burned well and threw out a great heat, even better than the best of the mountain turf. Known as baked turf, the peat mixture is moulded by hand into oblong shapes and left to dry in the normal way. Turf cutting spanned eons in Ireland, from the most primitive methods to the great mechanization which began in the 20s and continues to the present day. It is an industrious, if not an industrial, harvesting of a great natural resource. And consider the industry in this rare piece of footage. A great mehel has assembled at Ballynacarriga, County Cork. It is 1957, and Tony Lucas is there to record the making of mud turf in great quantities, a sight unlikely ever to be seen again. The peat is turned and stirred with shovels and hoes until it becomes fine and smooth, a kind of muddy slurry. Beaten and chopped until it is fine, this mud has channels cut into it, and water is sluiced again and again across the surface. The mixing goes on for a considerable time, and when the mixture is judged ready, barrow after barrow load brings it to the spreading ground where running the turf begins. As with any harvest, when once it has begun, there can be no stopping. The mud is spread and levelled, bare hands score short lines across the surface, and the neat blocks are quickly and carefully marked out. After a week or so, and granted that the weather has been kind, the mud blocks are fit to be lifted. Each separate turf is cut from the mass and carefully lifted out to dry standing on its end. It was a frugal economy, and there is a kind of rightness in the fact that the tool used to cut the individual blocks is a hay knife. Like saving the hay, turf gathering was a communal and labour-intensive activity. After the harvest, invariably, there was song and music and celebration. Early September, and the great annual battle is nearly over. The turf is cut and brought home, the harvest of corn is cut and dried. Now, with the great turn in the year approaching, there is one more task to be fulfilled on Hugh O'Connor's farm. In the old world, The day of the threshing was the closest men came to experiencing work as play and celebration. There is a kind of exuberance in the air. As sheaves are pitched up onto the platform of the thresher, the bands are cut and the sheaves are fed down into the mill. The machine threshes the sheaves, separating the grain from the straw. The grain will be spilled into waiting sacks, the straw carried off into the barn. And if there are more people here than are strictly needed, who could blame them for joining in the fun? The day of the threshing was like a circus day. Walls were knocked to allow the great machine access. Drink was got in, large quantities of drink. The neighbours were notified. Then the great machine lumbered and bumped down the narrow lane into the haggard. The bands were connected, the belts tensioned, the great wheels began to spin, and the threshing began. This is the origin of the phrase, everyone pitched in. Threshing was a great social event, so that the numbers present were often in excess of what was needed to get the work done. The threshing machines were hired out by large farmers and local merchants during the season. The machine would arrive in a locality and go from farm to farm as needed. Often the mehel formed on the first farm and followed on with the machine to the next farm and the next. Money rarely changed hands for this work, but each farmer was expected to show open-handed hospitality in the form of good food and drink. The women slaved all day preparing vast quantities of food. A bucket of porter would make the rounds, and if the work was hard, it was well fueled. Some of the older people say that the threshing would never have been done if copious quantities of drink had not been available. It was thirsty work right enough, but sometimes the vast quantities of drink could lead to things getting a bit out of hand. The story has it that at one threshing in County Limerick, a team of workers making a stack became so intoxicated with all the porter they'd drunk that coming into the evening, when the drink had risen in their heads, they were fit to blind one another with their pikes. Well, that's the story. Good progress is being made at the farm of Michael Coffey in Kilgovnet, County Kerry. The grain pours endlessly out of the machine and into waiting sacks. One after another, they are brought to the granary, down through the haggard. Sack after sack, the golden grain spills into the granary. Some bigger farms had stone granaries, but small farmers had other ways of storing their grain. Outdoor straw granaries are found in some areas. The granaries are a triumph of art and ingenuity, a perfect marriage of form and purpose. In some parts of Cork and Kerry, cylindrical granaries were constructed of straw on bases of furze, twigs or bramble. The straw was wound into thick coils, and the granary made by building up layers of these coils. Added as the work progressed, reinforcing the very structure meant to hold and protect it. As the grain was needed for each successive layer of the structure, the farmers had an incentive to see the threshing progressed quickly. Straw and grain were parted in the threshing, and then the same elements were combined again so that the stalks, which once held the grain off the ground until it ripened, now served to protect it until it was needed. When full, the granary was roofed with straw and securely tied down. The comparison with haystack or hayrick is apt and irresistible. Nobody should be so foolish as to romanticize what was behind it all, and yet, with the passing of the old ways, something was surely lost. In the 1920s, 4 times as many people worked the farms of Ireland as work them today. Individually, people may have better lives, but it is often the communities which suffer. Since the combine harvester took over from the threshing machine, the need for large gatherings of workers has disappeared. Ironically, these days, when the steam threshers turn up at local fairs or agricultural shows, huge crowds are drawn to them as spectators. On Hugh O'Connor's farm, the threshing is still a real working day, and if the method seems quaint, well, it is still real work involving large numbers of people. There are other ways of doing the job, and probably the most primitive method of threshing is scutching. This method is common all over the world. It is very ancient and requires no tools. A block of wood and a rock are all that's needed. The thresher takes the sheaf in his 2 hands and beats the grain out of the seed heads. Nothing could be simpler. The grain is then scooped up and sieved to remove any dirt or straw. A windy day is ideal for winnowing. A clean sheet is spread out on the ground. The grain is held high in the sieve or winnowing tray, and as the winnower tips the tray and shakes it, the grain falls straight to the ground and the wind carries the chaff away. A form of threshing that held sway on many small farms right up to the time the threshing machine came in was the use of the flail. Flailing could be done anywhere, outdoors or in the barn or in the house. It was a task often undertaken by family or farm labourers during bad weather or in winter after dark. All that was needed was a good surface to work on. In the early 19th century, this was often the middle of the road. The flail itself was made of 2 separate parts. The striker was made of holly, blackthorn or ash, the handle of hazel, oak or pine. The real art of making a flail was in the tyings, the loop of hide or skin which joined the 2 parts together. As usual, regional variations abounded. This one was filmed by John Lynch in Clonmacon, North Kerry. Different types of animal skin were used in the tyings, and eel skin was particularly favoured. In other places, rope, flax fibre, even willow were used. A good tie allowed the striker stick to swing freely round the handstaff. The man making the flail is Mick the Yank O'Sullivan, so called because his father had been a few years in the States. On many small holdings, in the absence of a barn, flailing was sometimes carried out in the kitchen during the long winter nights. This house is at Bolton's Cross near Listowel, County Kerry, and the two hardy lads doing all the work are Jim Toomey and Ned Sheehy. Often two men would thresh at the same time, and it was important that they worked together in a complementary rhythm. There is a skillful art in flailing, particularly in avoiding hard knocks, and it's tempting to think that part of the attraction of indoor winter flailing was the fun, for the audience at any rate, of watching things go wrong. On Hugh O'Connor's farm, the harvest is over, the work is done, the battle carried successfully to conclusion. The workers linger over a last drink, an old story or a new one. There is the sense of ease that comes over people when they have worked together and the job is well done. The treasure band is rolled and stored. All over the country, side, hook, riddle and schlan are safely put away. What lingers is memory. Call it the spirit of the harvest, if you will, a sense of sun and wind, of the summer's heat, of good feeling between neighbours and friends. Outside in the fields, the long chill of autumn is drawing in. Inside, warmed by the music and nurtured by memory, a new generation takes its place in the never-ending round. Outside the hall, far over the heads of bride and groom, families and neighbours, the immemorial harvest moon is flying high behind the clouds.